Hey, welcome to All the Fanfare. My name is Eric Pierce. Today we're going to sweep the leg and talk about Karate Kid, the 1984 film that I deeply love. I didn't know this before I started researching the pod, but Karate Kid was... I'm going to say Karate Kid, by the way, because calling it The Karate Kid seems pretentious, and I don't roll like that. It's the same reason that Goonies is Goonies, not The Goonies. So I'm dropping the thes because that's how we do it around here. Interesting fact I learned in researching the pod, the Karate, I'm going to say it this time, The Karate Kid was created in 1984 after Columbia Pictures signed director John G. Avildsen, who won a directing Oscar for Rocky. And that signing was with the express purpose of creating a similar kind of film, and I think structurally, from a screenwriting sense, if you compare the films, you can see a lot of similarities. And certainly with the finale, they both have incredible finales. But that was the reason, that was the impetus. And shortly after they got Avildsen on board, they brought on screenwriter Robert Mark Kamen, who used his own life for inspiration for the story. Check this out. Kamen took up martial arts after getting jumped by a gang of bullies at the 1964 World's Fair in New York. I probably shouldn't be laughing. That's not funny, but it sounds kind of funny because I'm picturing Danielson getting the crap beat out of him. His first instructor was an aggressive Marine captain who preached raw violence. He branched out later on and discovered Okinawan Goju-ryu, a defensive style, and he trained under a teacher who spoke little English but had learned directly from the founder of this Okinawan style, a sensei named Miyagi. Mind blown. That one took me by surprise, that this was grounded in truth. Speaking of Miyagi, we're going to talk about him a bit in the pod, but I just want to mention at the top, Pat Morita earned an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor for his portrayal, the first in that category for an Asian American. Unfortunately, he did not win. I actually don't know who won. If I was better prepared for this pod, I'd looked it up and told you who won the 1984-1985 Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. But I don't follow the Oscars because I don't care about the Oscars. Speaking of actors in the movie, I'm just going to run down a brief list of notable actors considered for the role of Daniel LaRusso. We have Robert Downey Jr., Charlie Sheen, Emilio Estevez, Nicolas Cage, Tom Cruise, Anthony Edwards, who was considered too tall, and Eric Stoltz. It's funny because a couple weeks ago I did the Top Gun pod, and a lot of these names popped up there as potential candidates for the role of Maverick. So in the 80s, you see a lot of the same names circling here. And just as I find the idea of Danielson as Maverick in Top Gun ridiculous, I likewise find the idea of Tom Cruise as Danielson in Karate Kid equally ridiculous. This one blew my mind. The only name I saw up for the role of Johnny Lawrence, the only other name I saw up for the role of Johnny Lawrence, other than William Zabka, was Crispin Glover. I can't imagine freaking McFly in this movie as the bully. It just does not work, but I kind of want to see it because I think it sounds like hilariously awful. But anyway, I thought that was funny. For the role of Allie, Helen Hunt, Demi Moore, or a couple of the big names, Elizabeth Shue got the role thanks in part to a popular Burger King commercial in the 80s, which is kind of crazy. And Karate Kid was her big screen debut. For me, Karate Kid is one of the three movies that sort of define the 80s. It's one of the trilogy of quintessential 80s films in my mind. And I'm excluding Star Wars. When you talk about trilogies with me, you gotta think I'm talking about Star Wars. But in this case, I'm not. Back to the Future, Karate Kid, and Goonies are my quintessential 80s movies. They do the best job of capturing what the 80s felt like at the time, and when I think back of my childhood of that time frame, they were probably three of my favorite movies, and they just seem the most 80s to me. Star Wars, something about Star Wars is just timeless. Here he goes talking about Star Wars again. Something about Star Wars is just timeless, and so it doesn't fit into a specific decade in my mind, but those movies definitely do. The other thing for me is specifically to Karate Kid is this movie taps into the unique pain of moving to a new city and a new school and making new friends, dealing with bullies. All experiences I had several times over because I bounced around quite a bit when I was growing up. Started a lot of different schools, different cities. Never did move to a different state, thankfully, but I know what it's like to be the new kid and feeling out of sorts, not having any friends, sitting by yourself, sort of. You're trying to, make friends and stuff, and then running afoul of bullies. Speaking of the move, this jumped out at me as I watched it this last time. Daniel's mom's story doesn't really check out in this movie at all, if you think about it. So the movie starts with them moving to California because she has a job with a computer company, ? Because it's super vague. Daniel doesn't know, which, okay, he's freaking 15 or 16, so of course he's probably not going to pay attention to what his mom's doing. But I just have to, question, like, what is her expertise? If you think about it, this was the 80s, an era in which computer jobs were highly specialized and required degrees. You weren't going on the internet to learn how to program. You got a degree. So, again, what is her expertise? She's working at this computer company, ? Doesn't seem to have any skills. And, when her demeanor and stuff, to me, doesn't scream like an IT nerd, right? So that's one thing I wanted to point out. The other thing, maybe even more interesting, is she's this never comes up again. The computer job. Shortly after they moved to Reseda, she's working at a restaurant, so the computer job just kind of vanished in thin air. And then we get a scene where she excitedly tells Daniel she's going to be trained as a manager, and basically the benefits. She says, I could never get them working in computers. And again, I'm just like, what world does this movie take place in? Because in the present day, computers, working in IT is kind of where it's at as far as benefits and pay and stuff. And then definitely, I would assume back in the 80s, that would be the case when very few people knew how to do this stuff. So again, it seems very shady to me, and I kind of think that Daniel's mom is one of those people who kind of chase dreams. They just believe everything they hear. They're very optimistic that things are going to be better. Grass is always greener, that kind of thing. And I think she just chased this. Maybe she saw a newspaper clipping for this computer position, and she just packed up and moved to California. Doesn't ever seem to get the job. Doesn't care about the job because she's moved on to other things. And it's all just very interesting. Daniel's father is not in the picture at all. In the sequel, I think we get Daniel talks a bit about his dad passing away. I think there was an illness or something. But as of this movie, you don't know what's going on. But in all, I like Daniel's mom. I think she's cool and all. I like that she's totally oblivious to how she looks. Like there's a scene where she takes Daniel and Allie out on their date, picks them up in the family station wagon, which breaks down in this ritzy neighborhood in front of Allie's rich parents, and doesn't think anything of, kind of just jumping out of the car and pushing it while it's in neutral. Just laughs it off. You gotta love that kind of energy, but at the same time, she's kind of a bit shady, I would say. This, to me, I mentioned this as a Karate Kid is a quintessential 80s movie. It's also one of my quintessential summer movies. And that may sound a little bit funny because most of it takes place during the school year after summer is out. But this always has felt like a summer movie to me. It could just be that I'm from Michigan and California just always looks like summer from that perspective. But there's a couple things really that jump out. There's the beach scene near the beginning of the movie where Daniel's playing soccer with Freddie and his new quote-unquote friends, and he sees Allie and is so gobsmacked at her beauty that he just stops playing and just gawks at her in the middle of their weird little soccer game. And that just continues on and on and on. There's also, we get the cool Cruel Summer drop. So Cruel Summer is a song by Bananarama from the 80s. It's a great song, the best song on this. I'm not going to say the best song on this soundtrack because You're the Best is pretty banging, but Cruel Summer is a great song, and it has a really iconic kind of mic drop scene. What would you call it? The needle drop, I guess. We're talking about music. But the scene where Daniel's trying out for soccer and then gets kicked out because Johnny and his boys are giving him grief, and then Daniel just goes off and wails on somebody. It's funny, when I think of Karate Kid, that scene and that specifically song always is one of the first things I think of. Speaking of Daniel LaRusso, I'm kind of two minds on Daniel. One, he's a sympathetic character. Two, he's also a bit annoying, more than a bit annoying at times. He's whiny and annoying. I totally can get on board with why Johnny wants to beat him up, even though Johnny is clearly the bully of this movie. We'll talk about quite a bit about Johnny, but Johnny's one of the, I think he's apex for 80s bullies. Not necessarily villains, but bullies. I would put him even above Biff Tannen, because I think Johnny has he's got some redeeming qualities, and you come to understand maybe how he became a bully, but he's definitely a bully. But yeah, Daniel, he just kind of brings all that on himself. Like, you feel bad for him when he's getting picked on for no reason, but he's instigating. And there's a scene in Halloween where he's wearing he's so afraid of showing up that he's wearing this intricate costume where he's inside a shower curtain so that he can go incognito and he won't get picked on. And then the Cobra Kais are in their iconic skeleton outfits, which, greatest costume ever, maybe in movies. I just love it. He goes out of his way to instigate with Johnny, and then they chase him down and beat him up because, I mean, let's be real. Johnny was rolling a joint, and Daniel just hosed him down, so he ruined the joint, and yeah, Johnny had, maybe if Johnny had smoked it, he would just be like, yeah, let's bygones be bygones. But Johnny hadn't got a smoke on yet, so he had to beat him down for that. I kind of understand. Daniel's also, he's a total doofus. He's not the smartest kid ever. Like, there's scenes where Miyagi's training him and Daniel's totally not getting it, and you as the audience, you understand what Miyagi's saying. Daniel doesn't get it because he's a freaking moron. I think Ralph Macchio does a good job with the role, but at the same time, it's not such an amazing performance that I think I want to see him reprise the character endlessly, to the point where, like, there wasn't much there for the character to begin with. I think The Karate Kid is a perfect one-and-done movie. That said, I do love Cobra Kai. We're going to talk about Cobra Kai. But it's not the Ralph Macchio, Daniel's son element that I enjoy from Cobra Kai. I could have seen this movie and then be happy never seeing Daniel's son again, to be honest. But in this movie, it totally works. Mr. Miyagi, he is my favorite character in the movie. He fills the father void in Daniel's life, and it's even, it's indirectly in that he's helping Daniel with kind of fatherly things, like he fixes his bike, he comes by the place to fix the sink, but more so, he's teaching Daniel, and even more directly, Miyagi learned karate from his father, and then in passing it on to Daniel, it becomes a more direct father-son kind of surrogate relationship. He's also Daniel's only friend, which there's a scene where Daniel gets, on Daniel's birthday, Miyagi lets him pick of the cars, which, incredible scene. It reminds me of when you'd watch TV shows in the 80s, and I don't remember what shows these were, but at the end of the show, sometimes there would be a sweepstakes or a mad dash through a Toys R Us where they could just fill a cart with everything they could grab in a minute. And that was always a dream, because, and you would always strategize, like, oh, you head to the video games because those are the big ticket items, and maybe swing through Star Wars on the way back or something like that. Like, that was my go-to move. So the scene where Miyagi lets Daniel choose a car, I always kind of pause that screen. I always want to pause the screen. I never do because I'm swept up in the emotion, the moment. But I just want to pause the screen and study the cars and try and decide which one I'd pick. The yellow one is pretty nice. But anyway, Daniel chooses the yellow convertible. I think it's a Ford. And then he's all overcome with emotion, and he tells Miyagi that he's the best friend he's ever had. And that's a beautiful sentiment, but it's also freaking kind of embarrassing because he's 16 years old, and the best friend he's ever had is this quasi-elderly guy that he only known for a couple of months. And yeah, of course, he's taught him some wonderful things, some wonderful life lessons, and he's entered this life and filled this void that we sense Daniel has, even though it's never directly addressed in the movie. But at the same time, the fact that this is his best friend he's ever had, I'm just like, okay, and you kind of can understand it because he's a doofus, he rubs people the wrong way, including the audience, at least for me. There's also, and I'm going to bring up Star Wars again, sorry. You know how it goes. If you're going to listen to my podcast, you're going to get some Star Wars. That's just kind of on brand. There's some obvious parallels to Yoda between Yoda and Miyagi. And I'm just going to read a couple of the quotes that Miyagi drops on Daniel. And this sounds super like something Yoda would say. Even kind of the broken English aspect. Miyagi says, "Fighting always last answer to problem." So that's kind of like the Jedi way of, use the Force for knowledge and defense. And then later, Miyagi even more directly says karate for defense only. He also has Yoda's sense of humor because Daniel's asking, there's a scene where Daniel's asking about, like, what kind of belt you have? Like, are you black belt? Are you like a 7-time black belt? What are you? And Miyagi's like... so he goes, Daniel goes, "What kind of belt do you have?" And Miyagi goes, "Canvas. You like? JCPenney, $3.98. He's poking fun at Daniel, and I love it because he's dropping knowledge on him at the same time as he's making fun of him. Very Yoda-esque. But the thing that stood out most to me about how much he reminded me of Yoda is when he's beginning to train Daniel, and Daniel's kind of meh. He's not fully committed. And Miyagi says, either you karate do yes or karate do no. You karate do guess so, squish just like grape. And he actually makes a squishing sound, but that's basically do or do not. There is no try. I mean, that is what it is. So yeah, Miyagi and Yoda, maybe that's part of the reason I love Miyagi, because he reminds me of Yoda, on top of the fact that he's just a great character. And I love that he has this wisdom, and you feel the weight of age on him, and has a healthy skepticism about everything, but also a healthy degree of humor about everything. But at the same time, there's this, and he's this wonderful mentor. But at the same time, we later learn there's this deep pathos to the character, because the reason he's alone, he wasn't always alone. He had a wife, and she was pregnant, and he was going to be a father, like for real. And then she passes away while he's off serving in World War II. And there was no doctor, basically. And it's a very tragic story. His wife was shipped off, and this really happened. His wife was shipped off with a bunch of Japanese Americans to these internment camps. And she died of complications in labor because there were no doctors around. There was maybe no hospital. And so while he's off doing his duty to serve the country that he loves, the country he loves does not love him back or love people that look like him back. And it's super tragic. And in fact, I think the scene where he's drunk and relaying this to Daniel is probably part of what got him that Oscar nomination, because it's such a great scene. But this movie, kind of one of the, it's obviously it's about karate, and that's the main thing. That's what get people in the door. This movie is really about fathers and sons, and it's interesting that the only actual father in this movie is Allie's dad. So you've got all these boys in this movie. You've got Daniel, you've got all the Cobra Kais. They have no fathers. They have fathers, but we never see them. What you see are their father figures, their surrogates. For Daniel, it's Miyagi. For Johnny and the Cobra Kais, it's Kreese. And it's very kind of a light side, dark side divide, in that you can see Miyagi makes a comment in this movie about there's no such thing as a bad student, only bad teachers. And you can see that play out here in the movie, because Miyagi is this compassionate teacher who wants the best for Daniel, and Kreese is this bully who's only interested in winning these trophies and in just winning influence for his dojo, and just being the best, being recognized as the best, and whatever it takes, like no mercy. That's his motto. And you can see the influence that someone can play on young, impressionable people, because that's what happens in this movie. The Cobra Kais are almost like a cult following their cult leader, and their relationship is totally different than Miyagi's and Daniel's. It's just really beautiful. I've circled around Johnny a bit. I want to talk about him because even though he's one of the greatest film bullies ever, certainly of the 80s. I think Biff Tannen might be slightly higher, but I don't like the character as much. There's something about Johnny that I kind of respond to, I guess, and maybe it's just kind of the recognition of, you are a product of your environment, and he's maybe not totally at fault for where he is. Obviously, he bears responsibility, but when you've got someone like Kreese in your ear teaching you that this is the way things should be, that's naturally going to bleed into how you behave. But speaking of Johnny, I just think there's something kind of timeless about the upper class jock that as a bully, like that archetype is just timeless. And he's, in my opinion, he's kind of the quintessential bully for that reason. I do have to question, every time I watch this movie, I have to wonder what the heck is going on with Johnny's hair. Like, his bangs are just like aggressively like swooping down on his forehead. It almost looks like he goes to Trump's stylist. Like, the bangs literally look like they're bolted onto his head or something. They just, I don't quite understand what's going on with his hair there. It always kind of like takes like 10% off his menace, because he just looks a little goofy. Let's be honest about that. There is no question that Ellie made the right choice in dumping him, because he does have major anger issues, but less so in choosing Daniel as her rebound. And you have to assume it's a rebound because Daniel's diametrically opposed to what everything Daniel has is opposite of what Johnny brought to the table. So you have to assume he's a rebound and nothing more, because Daniel doesn't bring much to the table. The interesting thing about Johnny is that William Zabka's performance, I wouldn't consider it very extraordinary or anything, but the character lives on in my memories, and maybe that's because I knew bullies like that, and there's something, because it feels real, I guess, in a way that like someone like Danielson doesn't. And also, I kind of just wonder, the way this movie ends, we're going to talk about this, but I just want to touch on it just briefly here. The way the fight ends, it feels like it kind of breaks Johnny's path. Like, Johnny's on a path. He loses that fight after Kreese tries to make him cheat to win. And you kind of, the way that Johnny reacts in defeat, it feels like his trajectory has changed significantly. And so I always wondered, what happens next for that character? Is he still a bully? Does he change? Of course, we get that with Cobra Kai. We get into that. I'm going to talk about Cobra Kai here. I'm not just teasing it, but I want to follow the flow here. That's going to come up later. But I think those are the reasons why Johnny feels more interesting as a bully, because if you look at the bullies from things like Revenge of the Nerds or, I don't know, Lucas or whatever, it never really felt like they had much of an arc. They were just statically the bully. They were the antagonist. They were there to oppose the hero, the protagonist, and get their comeuppance at some point, potentially. But there was never like a character development, character growth. But here with Johnny, just at the end of the tournament, we see a glimpse that maybe, just maybe, he will be changed by this experience. And I think that's always kind of interested me and made me curious to see what happened next with his story. Speaking of the tournament, we've danced around a bit and leading up to the tournament, because I want to talk about the tournament. We're going to talk about the tournament. We're going to talk about the Cobra Kais too, because they're a crucial element of this movie, and I love to hate them. But first, the tournament itself. I have to say, I think the tournament is quite possibly the greatest sports montage ever. And I'm saying that without doing really any prep. Like, I didn't go off and like Google sports movies montages, and maybe I should have. But the fact that this is the one that sticks in my brain, this is the one that I remember the best, tells me that I'm on the right track. It's at least a top 5, but for me personally, it's my favorite. The entire tournament leading up to the semifinals is this montage where we're seeing these bouts be waged, and Daniel's in some, and we see Johnny in some, and some of the Cobra Kais, and the field is progressively getting narrowed down, and all the while, You're the Best Around by Joe Esposito is singing, is in the background, and it's a banger song. It's a great song, and it makes you want to just stand up and fight somebody, and not really fight someone, but you just get hyped up, and that's part of what makes the tournament such a good, powerful scene. The other component of the fight is it feels so authentic. Like the actors are actually doing karate. You can see that. I'm not going to say they're doing good karate, but from my layman's perspective, they look pretty darn good. Adding to the realness factor is the fact that the guy in the intercom keeps mispronouncing Miyagi's name. I think that's just kind of a throwaway thing that maybe most people don't notice, but it always makes me laugh because it feels legit. And speaking of the realness of the tournament, they actually had 500 to 1,000 people in the stands as extras, and they staged it as an actual tournament. So they, in order to make it look real, they had a legit tournament running in the background with a couple hundred competitors, and they happen to have the Karate Kid stuff going on on the side. So, Johnny and Daniel and these guys are fighting, but in the background, people are really fighting for trophies and stuff. And that's how they got some of the extras there, and that's how they got that. There's just a realness to the tournament that every time I watch it, I'm just blown away because it doesn't feel staged. It feels legit. It feels real. And so you get swept up in the emotion of it because it feels like a sport that you're watching on TV versus a movie at that point, which I think then enables that climax to hit harder because it feels like you are seeing something. Like the best thing about watching sports is seeing something miraculous happen that you've never seen before or never thought you could see. The spontaneity of those kinds of things, and here in the Karate Kid movie we get that, the finale, because, and again, I think it's because of the way this is shot. It feels real. The other thing I thought was cool about this is they did the run of the fight from the beginning all the way to the trophy presentation. They ran through it and they shot it like theater. So it wasn't like, cut. Like they were literally doing it scene by scene and shooting it like theater, and the crowd was getting into it. And you can actually, I think that you can see that in the performances of the actors because they're getting caught up in the emotion of the moment too, because it becomes real at that point. I love that. The whole tournament, it's just so good. Like this movie's great, but then once you get to the tournament, it just goes up to 11. It's just such a great song. It's such a great movie. Speaking of You're the Best, I did think this anecdote was interesting. So Joe Esposito said that this is his signature song, which is obvious. But what I didn't know was this song was originally for Rocky 3. So again, tying this movie to Rocky again, like you can't escape Rocky's shadow. That song was originally for Rocky 3, ended up in Karate Kid, and I'm so glad it did because it's pitch perfect. It's such a great montage, and the song is part of what makes it so good. So we're leading up to the finale, but before we do that, I do want to talk about the Cobra Kais, because for background, I'm going to call them background characters, I think they all have their own personalities, and it's actually during the fight where you really get a better idea of who these characters are. Up until the tournament, they kind of just seem like Johnny's entourage, but here in the tournament, because the way the tournament progresses, we get to see all of his henchmen, I'll call them, participate, and then through their fight and stuff, you get to actually get a sense of who these guys are. So there's Dutch. He's the bleach blonde kid, super cocky. I actually would argue he's a bigger bully than Johnny, and he definitely seems more problematic. Some guys just smell crazy, and that guy does smell like he's nuts. So there's Bobby. This is the guy that to me, he always looked a bit like John Ritter's kid brother. He's got the feathered brown hair and kind of he just vaguely reminds me of John Ritter. He seems like maybe the one good guy in Cobra Kai. Like he's the one who doesn't want. Kreese tells him to take Daniel out of the tournament basically by hitting him illegally, knocking him out physically so he can't compete anymore. He doesn't want to do it. He does it grudgingly and then immediately jumps on Daniel and is like apologizing profusely to him because I assume he feels guilty. But that whole sequence made me think, okay, Bobby is maybe the one Cobra Kai that has a conscience. Like, he's not so bad. Tommy is the guy that looks like he likes to set fires for fun. He's kind of got crazy eyes. He is the guy that says, get him a body bag, which is one of the great ad-libs of all time. And it's one that I like to just drop sometimes in a text thread or something if the opportunity arises, because it's such a great line. Then there's Jimmy. He's sort of the extra of the group. He barely speaks. He's only a brown belt. Literally forgettable. Like, he's just there. Compared to the other three, he doesn't even register on the radar. And then the last thing, he doesn't have a speaking role. He's not part of Johnny's entourage. But watch out for Lamar from Lambda 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 in this movie. He's in 2 scenes. He's a Cobra Kai. We see him once in the dojo where he gets his butt kicked, and once in this movie where he gets his butt kicked in the tournament. And it just makes me laugh that he's in this movie because I do love Revenge of the Nerds, and he's very prominent in that movie. But I think one of my favorite things about the tournament, in addition to everything I said about the montage, is it gradually reveals that Johnny and the Cobra Kai aren't actually the villains. Yes, they are bullies. No question, they're bullies. But villains, no. Like I mentioned at the beginning, they're a product of a bad teacher, a man without honor, he's corrupted them. He's led them to the dark side. There are moments where when Kreese tells Bobby to knock Daniel out with a cheap shot, you see Johnny and Tommy in the background they both look disappointed to hear this. And these guys hate Daniel, but they want a good clean fight. They want to be in fair and square. So that's always a telling moment for me. And then when Kreese tells Johnny to sweep the leg, this is the best moment of acting that William Zabka has in the whole movie, because he looks absolutely horrified by the very idea, the very suggestion of doing that, of attacking someone's weakness in order to knock them out of the fight. I've always loved that. Up to this point, Johnny has been very one-note jerk. He's a douchebag with a motorcycle, and like he's mean to Allie, and he's a jerk to Daniel. But in this moment, you get this glimpse of his humanity, and I've always loved that. And then it's crazy how quickly you come around on Johnny, because he has that look of horror in his eyes when Kreese tells him to sweep the leg, and then seconds later, when the fight's over, he's giving Daniel the trophy and telling Daniel he's all right because he's earned Daniel respect. And obviously, Johnny probably feels guilty for his role in everything that's happened. But it's such a great mini character arc. I love it so much. And it always interesting to me too that when Johnny's handing the trophy to Daniel, he looks like he's crying. For a long time, I took it as he's like overcome with emotion or guilt or something. Now I think it's probably because he just took a crane kick to the face, and his noses, his sinuses or whatever, are probably going crazy on him. But either way, it just reads as he's emotional, he's caught up in the moment, whatever. And I think it just works. It's just a great, great character development moment for the antagonist. The movie didn't have to give that to us, but I love that it did. And that's part of what makes this movie so good, in my opinion. The finale itself is one of the greatest of the 80s. No matter how many times I've seen it, I still get an emotional high from the climax. It's so effective. The crane kick is, it shouldn't work. It's dumb, let's be honest. But the way it's shot with the music rising and everything else, it's just, man, like I remember hearing stories about people standing up and cheering at the theater. That doesn't really happen anymore, but like, if I saw this in the theater, I probably would jump up and cheer. Like if I had seen this in theater back in the 80s, because it's just such a rising emotional moment that how can you not get excited about that? And unfortunately, the excellent finale is probably why we had a slew of successively worse sequels. There's just something elemental about this film that none of the others have been able to recapture, whether it was the setup with Daniel and the bullies, the Cobra Kais, the tournament itself, the way it was shot, the finale, all that stuff. It all adds together to make this such a timeless movie, and they've never been able to recapture it. But it's so powerful that they keep trying, because it is a legendary movie in my mind. I mean, it's not, the best of the best, but man, it's pretty darn good. Pretty darn good. And that's also why I think Daniel's story is complete. We really don't need any more Daniel LaRusso stories. The legacy of this show, I think I touched on a bit on the sequels. They're bad to worse. But what redeems all of these efforts is the Cobra Kai spinoff. Of all the attempts to mine what made this film so successful, it's easily come the closest. And I think in my mind it's because they brought back Johnny and made him integral to the story, to the extent that, at least early on, it's the Johnny Lawrence story. Like I mentioned earlier, the fate of Johnny Lawrence has always been something that fascinated 80s kids. It wasn't just me. In fact, Patton Oswalt has an incredible bit that came out in the early 2000s, I believe, where he talked about Johnny Lawrence. He wrote something that took some creative license with films William Zabka was in the 80s, but basically explored what happened to Johnny Lawrence after this film. I'll drop it in the show notes because it's pretty funny. It's a YouTube clip where Patton's reading it. It's pretty funny. But I think it just kind of taps into the fact that most of us, maybe not most of us, maybe it's just me and Patton, but some of us have wondered about Johnny. And why I love Cobra Kai so much is it gives us the continuation of the Johnny Lawrence story, to the point that I get annoyed when the story focuses on Daniel, because we had all kinds of movies with Daniel, and it kind of bugs me that Johnny's story has to always be in somehow relation to Daniel LaRusso, that he can't just have his own thing, that everything about Johnny is somehow a response to Daniel. In some way, I guess that makes sense, because again, if you look at the finale of this film, there's, Johnny's going down one path, and then this schism happens when he loses that fight and realizes that, maybe he doesn't want to follow Kreese's dictates and his kind of just life philosophy, and he wants to do something different. That sets him off on a different path, and I like that we get to see what that looks like in Cobra Kai. Now, it's kind of funny that at the beginning of Cobra Kai, he's basically just a loser, and he's down on his luck, he's a drunk, he's a jerk, and life has not been good for Johnny Lawrence. So in some ways that that kind of makes me sad, actually, because it's almost like the lesson from Karate Kid for Johnny Lawrence. He just goes into this tailspin and never recovers, where it seems like coming out of Karate Kid, maybe he has this awakening to the possibilities of life, to being empathetic and those kinds of things. And I think I do love the setup of Cobra Kai, don't get me wrong, but I do think it kind of, in some way, it betrays a little bit the spirit of how this movie ends. But at the same time, I do like seeing Johnny Lawrence kind of, Arrested Development, stuck in the 80s, driving his hot rod, listening to, hair rock metal and watching Iron Eagle. And I do love that he never moved on, but at the same time, the end of the way this movie ends, it kind of made me wish that he had. Again, keeping in mind that I do love Cobra Kai, at least the Johnny Lawrence part of Cobra Kai. There's the one thing that I think is funny about what this movie initiates, and then everything that has come after has kind of continued, is this concept that karate is so vital that to the Valley. Like, in the Valley, karate is the thing. It's the only thing that matters. Like, we see soccer tryouts in this movie, but that's a pastime. No one cares about soccer, bro. It's all about the karate. And I wrote a story. I'll drop it in the show notes. It's a satirical piece about how this movie and the spin-off shows build up karate to be this all-encompassing, like almost life and death pursuit, when in reality karate's not that at all, but in the Valley it is. And I think it's kind of funny to think about, like, why is karate so important in the Valley, and to the point that everyone's lives kind of revolve around it. It's one of those things that just made me laugh. So I wrote about that a bit. All that being said, Johnny Lawrence is the best part of Cobra Kai, to the point that I get a little annoyed, a little irritated when it focuses on the teenagers and their melodrama, because I'm in my 40s. I'm not about that anymore. I just want to see Johnny. I want justice for Johnny. And it's not just justice. For me, justice isn't like he was wronged. I just want to see that development. I want to see him become the person he could have been, that he should have been coming out of this movie. I want to see that. Justice for Johnny. Well, that's going to be it for this episode. I'll be back next week talking with my brother about fantasy football. And I know what you're thinking. Fantasy football, it's like a sports game for nerds. And yes, that may be true, but it's also incredibly fun pastime. My brother and I have been in the same league for 20 years, and we'll be talking a bit about why we love it, why we do it, and just sharing some stories. So even if you have no interest in fantasy football, you just want to hear me talk to my brother about silly stuff, tune in for that. Until next time, I'll catch you on the flippity flop. Peace out.